Japan, the land of the rising sun, a nation of breathtaking contradiction, where ancient temples stand in the shadow of glittering skyscrapers, where the roar of bullet trains echoes across valleys once crossed by samurai warriors on horseback. Today, Japan is one of the most visited, most admired, and most technologically advanced nations on Earth. But the story of how this island archipelago became what it is today, that story stretches back 40,000 years, through war and isolation, through typhoons and atomic fire, through the rise and fall of shoguns, samurai, and emperors. This is the entire history of Japan. Long before the world knew Japan's name, human beings had already made these islands their home. Some 40,000 years ago, the first settlers crossed from mainland Asia onto the Japanese archipelago. Hunters and gatherers who would, over millennia, transform into farmers and craftsmen. These early peoples, known to history as the Jomon culture, developed sophisticated pottery, among the earliest in the world. They were later joined by a new wave of migrants, the Yayoi people, who brought with them two gifts that would change the islands forever: agriculture and metalworking. Rice cultivation spread across the lowlands. Bronze and iron tools replaced stone. And from these foundations, permanent settlements grew, and with them, the seeds of civilization. By the 3rd century AD, much of southern Japan had coalesced into a centralized power structure, a loose but unified kingdom centered on the Yamato region, ruled by a sacred monarch known as the Emperor. The Age of Japan had begun.
Japan did not develop in isolation. From the very beginning, its culture was shaped by powerful neighbors across the water. In the year 552, Buddhism arrived from Korea, not merely as a religion, but as an entire cultural package: art, architecture, philosophy, and writing. The Japanese court embraced it eagerly. Then, in 645, came the Taika reforms, a sweeping reorganization of Japanese governance modeled on the imperial system of Tang Dynasty China. Bureaucracy replaced tribal custom. Centralized authority attempted to govern a land that had long been fragmented. And in 794, Emperor Kamu made a decision that would echo through the ages. He fixed the imperial capital in one location, the city that would become Kyoto. The Heian period had begun. Nearly 4 centuries of courtly elegance, artistic flourishing, and refined sensibility. The Heian court became a world unto itself, a place of poetry competitions and elaborate ceremonies where aristocrats measured their worth in aesthetic refinement. But beauty has a price. While the court retreated deeper into its own world, the provinces beyond Kyoto began to slip out of imperial control. Power was drifting away from the palace and toward the warrior clan.
Clans gathering strength in the countryside. From the decline of imperial authority arose one of history's most iconic warrior culture: the samurai. Armed retainers bound by codes of loyalty and martial excellence became the true power brokers of medieval Japan. 2 clans rose above all others: the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry ignited the Hogan Rebellion of 1160, which then exploded into the Genpei War of 1180 to 1185, a devastating 5-year conflict that tore Japan apart. When the smoke cleared, it was the Minamoto clan, led by the brilliant Yoritomo, who stood victorious. In 1192, Yoritomo secured from Emperor Go-Toba the title of Shogun, Great General, establishing a military government in the distant city of Kamakura. The age of the shogunate had begun, and it would last for 700 years. The samurai skills were soon tested by the most fearsome military force the world had ever seen. In 1265, Kublai Khan, ruler of the vast Mongol Empire, demanded Japan's submission. Japan refused, and so the Mongols came. In 1274, a Mongol fleet landed on the island of Kyushu. The samurai defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the finest cavalry archers in history. But then, the sky darkened. The sea churned. A massive typhoon swept in from the Pacific and obliterated the Mongol fleet. 7 years later, in 1281, the Mongols tried again with an even larger force. And again, a typhoon appeared at the critical moment, destroying the fleet entirely. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, the divine winds. For them, it was proof that the gods themselves protected their land.
But the cost of defense had been enormous. The shogunate treasury was nearly empty. The samurai who had fought so hard went unpaid. Resentment festered.
The samurai's discontent was the opening that Emperor Go-Daigo needed. In 1333, he launched a coup to reclaim imperial authority. For a brief, shining moment, the emperor ruled once more. It lasted 5 years. By 1338, a new shogun, Ashikaga Takauji, had restored military rule. But this shogunate was far weaker than the one it replaced. Real power now resided with the regional feudal lords, the daimyo, each commanding their own armies of samurai, each ruling their territories like independent kings. What followed was one of the most chaotic periods in Japanese history. The Onin War of 1467, fought to decide the shogunate's succession, shattered the feudal system entirely. Japan dissolved into a patchwork of warring states, each daimyo struggling to expand at the expense of his neighbors. This era, the Sengoku, or Warring States period, lasted over a century. It saw the emergence of ninjas, masters of covert warfare and assassination. It saw Buddhist warrior monks march into battle, and it would eventually witness the arrival of something that would... In 1543, a Portuguese trading ship, blown off course, made landfall on the small island of Tanegashima. The 3 traders aboard were the first Europeans to set foot in Japan. They brought with them a weapon the Japanese had never seen, the musket. Within a decade, Japanese craftsmen had mastered the technology. Within 2 decades, hundreds of thousands of firearms were circulating among the warring daimyo. The age of the gun had arrived in Japan. Christianity arrived with the traders as well. Portuguese missionaries found eager converts, and the church's influence grew, particularly because converted daimyo received preferential access to firearms. One daimyo saw the opportunity more clearly than anyone: Oda Nobunaga. He didn't convert to Christianity, but he weaponized the new technology with cold strategic genius. Nobunaga began the process of unifying Japan by force, slaughtering rivals, razing fortresses, and bending the daimyo to his will. In 1582, at the very moment of final triumph, Nobunaga was ambushed and killed by a treacherous subordinate. His legacy was inherited by an extraordinary man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a peasant's son who had risen from foot soldier to daimyo to the most powerful man in Japan. Hideyoshi completed what Nobunaga had started. Japan was unified. But Hideyoshi, conscious of his lowborn origins, never claimed the title of shogun. He ruled instead as imperial regent. When he died in 1598, he left behind an infant heir and 5 powerful subordinates who had sworn to protect the child until he came of age. The oath lasted barely 2 years. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Sekigahara in the autumn of 1600. On one side, the allies of Hideyoshi's infant son. On the other, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most calculating and patient of Hideyoshi's 5 regions. The battle lasted a single day. Ieyasu won. From that day forward, Japan would be ruled by the Tokugawa dynasty for 268 unbroken years. Ieyasu moved the shogunate's seat of government to a small fishing village called Edo, a place that would one day become one of the greatest cities on earth, known today as Tokyo. The Edo period that followed was defined above all by one thing: stability. After a century of warfare, Japan was exhausted and peace was welcome. But Tokugawa peace came with a price. The shogunate introduced rigid social stratification: samurai at the top, then farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Mobility between classes was virtually impossible. The government kept daimyo weak through an elaborate system requiring them to spend alternate years in Edo, away from their home domains, their families left behind as de facto hostages. Christianity was suppressed, then persecuted, then outlawed entirely by 1638. The shogun feared that Catholic loyalty to a foreign pope could undermine political control. And then came the most dramatic step of all. In 1639, the third Tokugawa shogun, Iemitsu, implemented the policy known as Sakoku, closed country. Japan's borders were sealed. Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad. Those already overseas were forbidden from returning.
The construction of ocean-going vessels was banned. Trade was reduced to a trickle. Limited commerce with China and Korea, and a single European nation, the Dutch, confined to the tiny artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. For 2 centuries, Japan turned inward. And something remarkable happened.
Without foreign disruption, Japanese culture blossomed. Kabuki theater flourished. Poetry and woodblock printing became art forms of extraordinary sophistication. Cities grew. The population doubled to 30 million. Roads were built. Schools opened. Urban culture, unique to Japan, took root and thrived. The great cities of Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka became centers of commerce, culture, and intellectual life that rivaled anything in the wider world, even as that world was kept carefully at arm's length. But by the late 18th century, cracks were beginning to show. Agricultural growth had stalled. Devastating famine struck in the 1830s, and the government's response was slow and inadequate. Ideas from the outside world, smuggled in through Dutch books at Dejima, circulated quietly among Japanese scholars, raising uncomfortable questions about how long isolation could last. The answer arrived on a July morning in 1853 in the form of 4 black warships steaming into Edo Bay. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy had come to Japan with a simple message from the American government: open your ports to trade or face the consequences. The warship's cannons, far beyond anything the shogunate could match, made the alternative very clear. The shock that rippled through Japan was unlike anything the country had felt in centuries. The shogunate, that ancient institution which had ruled Japan since the time of the samurai, appeared suddenly, humiliatingly powerless. After months of agonized deliberation, the shogun agreed to Perry's demands. Ports were opened. Trade agreements followed, first with America, then with Britain, then with Russia. For many Japanese, this was an unacceptable capitulation. Among the most outraged were the powerful southern domains of Choshu and Satsuma, regions that had long chafed under Tokugawa domination. They saw in Perry's black ships not just a foreign insult, but an opportunity. In 1868, these 2 domains formed an alliance, rallied behind the young Emperor Meiji, and marched on Edo. After a series of battles known as the Boshin War, the Tokugawa shogunate, that 700-year institution, collapsed. Japan would never be the same again. The Emperor Meiji was 15 years old when power was restored to him. He would rule for 44 years, and in that time, oversee the most extraordinary national transformation in modern history. The Meiji Restoration was not merely a change of government. It was a revolution, a deliberate, urgent, sometimes brutal project to remake Japan from the ground up. The imperial court relocated to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, Eastern Capital. A new constitution was written. A parliament, the Diet, was established. The old feudal domains were abolished and replaced by a system of prefectures governed by the central state. Samurai, who had been Japan's warrior class for 6 centuries, were stripped of their stipends, forbidden from carrying swords in public, and rendered obsolete by a modern conscript army. Some adapted, others rebelled, most notably in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, when disgruntled samurai under Saigo Takamori rose against the government they had helped create. The modern imperial army crushed them within months. Meanwhile, Japan was transforming at breathtaking speed. Hundreds of Western advisors, engineers, lawyers, military officers, bankers, educators were invited to Japan to share their expertise. Railways appeared, telegraph lines crossed the mountains, universal education was introduced. Christianity, which had been illegal, was permitted once more. The army adopted Prussian military doctrine. The Navy modeled itself on Britain's Royal Navy. Japan was not simply borrowing from the West, it was racing to surpass it. And then came war. In 1894, Japan went to war with China over influence in Korea. In a conflict that shocked the world, Japan's modernized, highly motivated forces demolished the much larger Chinese army and navy in less than a year. Taiwan was annexed. China was forced to pay a massive indemnity. Japan had announced itself as a new power. 8 years later,
In 1902, Japan signed a military alliance with Britain, the first treaty of equality between a Western power and an Asian nation. Then, in 1904, came an even more stunning achievement: war with Russia. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 ended with Japan's complete strategic victory. At the Battle of Tsushima Strait, Japan's navy annihilated Russia's Baltic fleet in one of the most decisive naval engagements in history. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea. An Asian nation had not merely defended itself from Western imperialism, it had joined the game and was winning. In less than half a century, Japan had gone from a feudal, isolated country opened by force to one of the great powers of the world. The 20th century began with Japan as a rising star of the international order. Japan joined the Allies in World War I, claiming German colonies in the Pacific. It participated in the Treaty of Versailles. It joined the League of Nations. But beneath the surface, darker forces were gathering. The rapid modernization of the Meiji era had created an intensely nationalistic military culture, one that increasingly viewed expansion not as ambition, but as destiny. Japan's growing population needed resources. Asia, still largely under Western colonial control, offered them. In 1931, the Japanese military, acting without government authorization, seized Manchuria in northeastern China, establishing a puppet state. The government in Tokyo, unable or unwilling to restrain its own army, became increasingly militarized. In 1937, full-scale war with China erupted. The Second Sino-Japanese War was marked by horrific atrocities, most notoriously in Nanjing, where tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were massacred. The international community watched with growing alarm as Japan's army spread across China. The United States responded with economic sanctions, cutting off oil and steel that Japan's war machine desperately needed. Japan, in turn, forged the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in 1940, further straining relations with the Western democracies. And then came the decision that would seal Japan's fate. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within hours, Japanese forces simultaneously struck targets across Southeast Asia: the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Japan had awoken the sleeping giant. For nearly 4 years, a savage war raged across the Pacific. Island by island, at terrible cost to both sides, American forces fought their way toward the Japanese home islands. By 1945, Japan's cities were being firebombed nightly. Its navy was destroyed. Its air force was bled white. But Japan's military leadership refused to consider surrender. From the ashes of the most devastating defeat in its history, Japan rebuilt. Under the Allied occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur, Japan was comprehensively reformed. The military was dissolved and dismantled. War was constitutionally renounced. Article 9 of the new Japanese Constitution forbade the maintenance of armed forces for offensive war. Emperor Hirohito was permitted to remain on the throne, but required to publicly renounce his divine status. Japan became a democracy, guided initially by the pragmatic leadership of Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, who made a strategic choice that would define Japan's post-war trajectory. Rather than pursue geopolitical power, Japan would pursue economic power. The results were staggering. By 1955, Japan's economy had surpassed its pre-war levels. By 1968, Japan had become the world's second largest capitalist economy. Japanese automobiles flooded global markets. Japanese electronics, Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba became household names around the world. Japan's industrial model of efficiency, quality, and continuous improvement, Kaizen, became a global benchmark. The nation that had been incinerated in 1945 became, by the 1970s, an economic miracle. Cities were rebuilt, not merely restored, but reimagined. Bullet trains connected the country at speeds once unimaginable. Life expectancy soared. Education ranked among the world's finest. Today, Japan stands as a nation of 125 million people, occupying an archipelago of islands smaller than California, yet ranking as the world's third largest economy, a global leader in technology, medicine, and the arts. Its popular culture, anime, manga, cuisine, architecture, fashion, has spread to every corner of the globe.
From 40,000 years of human habitation to a Stone Age hunting culture, from the elegance of the Heian court to the fury of the samurai, from the isolation of Sakoku to the shock of Perry's black ships, from the catastrophe of World War II to the phoenix-like rebirth of the post-war miracle. The story of Japan is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of human history. It is the story of a people who faced annihilation more than once and chose every time to begin again. The sun rises over Japan, as it always